Holy Spirit. Amen. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou amongst women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen. So we're continuing this part of the Summa on Fortitude. So last time we started with this question, Fortitude, and then, second article. Good. On whether fortitude is a virtue, and if you recall, we saw how St. Thomas Aquinas frames the whole question of fortitude in the Christian life within this understanding of infirmity. So we're looking at virtue is perfected in infirmity. Strength, my power, is perfected in weakness. Remember that verse from St. Paul, and that was what we looked at last time. So there were some pretty interesting kind of conclusions that we could draw from that. Notably, for me, I think one of the most interesting things that I took away from that article was, so if fortitude is primarily this spiritual strength, right? Because we could see it as physical strength, and our immediate sort of representation of what strength looks like is, being a conqueror in war, being able to resist physical difficulties. So fortitude really strikes us in this as a physical thing. And yet, we saw from the body of that article that the primary place of strength and fortitude has to do with reason directed towards the good. And that spiritual strength of fortitude is going to come from this clear discernment, reason. So the first thing that needs to be purified is reason. And then fortitude is going to adhere to a difficult good. So what is just, we could discern it, but we need fortitude sometimes to execute what is just. Even if we know what's right, sometimes we hesitate, and there's this virtue, fortitude. So it's a spiritual strength. So what's interesting is this spiritual strength is supposed to be countering, now looking at our theological life, our greatest weakness. Coming to the aid of our greatest weakness. So the question then is, what is our greatest weakness? And as Christians, obviously we know it's sin. That's the spiritual weakness. It's not a physical weakness, it's a spiritual weakness. And primarily, first and foremost, the sin of pride. So what's incredible is to see in a Christian perspective that fortitude is very curiously tied to the virtue of humility, as this going against the spiritual weakness that is pride. And it's interesting how on the surface we would tend to equate people who are strong-willed, strong character with people who are proud. I mean, there's a kind of strange association that we would make, somebody who's very comfortable with themselves, etc. Maybe pride. Whereas when St. Paul is talking about his weakness, I cannot do what my will, I do not do what my will intends, but what actually I didn't intend to do, that's what I end up doing. So Paul is able to recognize his weakness. And in order to then rely on God's grace, there's a great act of humility. So humility becomes in a very interesting way. That's what I'm inviting you to think about and to consider. That was something that I got out of this first article that I thought was pretty interesting. How humility, is, for the Christian life, especially humility is associated with this strength, with this fortitude. Because the strength that we have is not just our own, but a strength that comes from God. And the weakness that prevents us from receiving the strength of God is our pride, primarily. So those were just some of my thoughts. Did anybody else have something that they remembered from the article that they were still thinking about, or that they thought was interesting? There was, at the end, this kind of thing that we had discussed where there's two possible ways that we can kind of fall off track, so to speak. There's two different, the sensible good or evil has an influence on us in basically two different ways. And I need to take a look at it.
Could you say that again?
Yeah, I need to look at the text again to get that in better language. Okay, so it's in the last part of the body of the article. Now, the human will is hindered in two ways from following the rectitude of reason. So reason has made its judgment. Justice appears to the mind. Now the follow-through. And there's something that goes wrong in the follow-through, in the exercise of that discernment. First, it could be drawn by some object of pleasure to something other than what the rectitude of reason requires. And the virtue of temperance takes that away. Second, the will can be disinclined to follow that which is in accord with reason on account of some difficulty that presents itself. In order to remove this obstacle, fortitude of the mind is requisite, whereby to resist the aforesaid difficulty, even as a man, by fortitude of the body, overcomes and removes bodily obstacles. So we see that there's this fortitude is one of the two virtues that allow us to continue adhering to what reason has discerned. So reason discerns the good, and fortitude in the face of difficulties that present themselves, like, oh man, it's going to be really hard. Give up. Okay, fortitude is that virtue that allows us to overcome the obstacles. And then temperance is the virtue that allows us to maintain our focus on the higher good and not be drawn away by sensible goods. Does that make sense? Because I think that's a pretty good and clear. And there's not like another thing that could possibly take us off track. So as you're discerning, how was it that I got off track here? Well, it was either a sensible good that you gave all of your attention to when instead of remaining focused on what your reason had discerned, or it's because you kind of gave up in front of the fight. You're like, it's going to be too hard. So, even though it was something good. So, that's an interesting kind of little way to see, was it fortitude that I lacked, or was it temperance? What is it in English?
E-R-A.
E-R. Temperance. So just a little reminder, let's move on. If there aren't any other things that people were remembering or want to toss in there, we'll move on to the next particle. I think there's some good keys in this one to remember. Let us then move on to the second article. Just give everyone a little moment to think. Now, Article 2. Let's begin. Whether virtue is a special virtue. Special virtue. Go ahead.
Objection 1.
Mm-hmm.
It seems that fortitude is not a special virtue, for it is written, she teaches temperance and prudence and justice and fortitude, where the text has virtue for fortitude. Since then the term virtue is common to all virtues, it seems that fortitude is a general virtue.
Okay. Do you want to put that objection in other words?
A translation of the Book of Wisdom uses virtue in place of fortitude, which makes it seem that the fortitude refers to just a general virtue.
Mm-hmm. Good. Everybody see that here? So that's a pretty easy objection to understand, I think. No problem there. Good. Now, where do you see the potential the places where this is going to, where he's going to maybe focus, or where he could possibly focus?
Well, I think we talked about how the virtus comes from fear, right? Don't know if this is going to be going in the right place.
Strength.
Strength.
So the word virtue, right? Veer. Oh, you said veer, not fear.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm sorry. Go ahead. Thought you said fear.
I don't know if that's a way he would go, but that's just the first thing that popped into my head, that fortitude has especially to do with strength.
Mm-hmm.
And so it could make sense that a translation could use virtus in place of fortitude, because they both have to do with strength. It doesn't mean that it meant virtue in general.
Right. Yeah, I think so. That's what I would say too. But, good. Anybody want to add anything to that? No? Okay. Let us then keep going. On the contrary. It's real short. It's like not even a sentence.
On the contrary, Gregory numbers it among the other virtues.
So that just means that even though in the scriptures we have the word virtue as basically substituted for fortitude, when Gregory explains the commentary in his Moralia, his commentary on the moral life, he explicitly says fortitude is in there. So if one of the fathers of the church says that fortitude, this is the theological argument, if one of the fathers of the church says that we can include fortitude, then that's the right way to interpret Scripture also. It's just, once again, that's the mechanics of the theologian thinking through it. Now the more philosophical reflection, I answer that, because just because someone said so, we all know that's not good enough. St. Thomas knows that too. Don't worry, he'll explain. Okay.
I answer that, as stated above, the term fortitude can be taken in two ways. First, as simply denoting a certain firmness of mind, and in this sense it is a general virtue, or rather a condition of every virtue, since the philosopher states, it is requisite for every virtue to act firmly and immovably. Secondly, fortitude may be taken to denote firmness only in bearing and withstanding those things wherein it is most difficult to be firm, namely in certain grave dangers.
Okay, let's stop and try to understand those two things. So there's two senses that we could take the word fortitude in. So there is something general about fortitude, and there is something specific. So here, fortitude, the spiritual strength of reason, the strength of reason, that's something kind of general, and that's the first sense of fortitude. And even when Aristotle talks about the virtues, he'll say that's one of the qualities of virtue in general, is that it's a firmness in activity, it's a firmness, it's something that doesn't move easily. A virtue resists, in general, some other orientation than according to reason. So, in some sense, fortitude is a quality of virtues in general. Now, what is the specific quality of fortitude? How is fortitude a special virtue? This here is just general. And then here we're going to say special.
Bearing and withstanding those things which are most difficult to be firm, namely in certain great dangers.
Okay, so here he's going to place it having to do with danger. Or we could say obstacle. Probably danger is the best. Danger is really the best. But then obstacles, insofar as they would threaten, our well-being or something like that. So danger is probably the best word for that. Because if we go too far, then we find ourselves back in this firmness of mind category. That's the general sense of fortitude. So the special sense of fortitude has to do with danger. Resisting the temptation to flee when my life is being threatened, when something dangerous is happening.
So you're saying that it's both general and special?
In one way, we can use fortitude in a general way. And in a general way, all virtue implies firmness. And in that sense, fortitude is in the general sense a quality of all the virtues. Yeah. And then when we really talk about the virtue of fortitude, we're referring to this encounter with danger. We saw a little bit as opposed to...
So you're saying it's two different meanings of the word fortitude?
For us, we only really talk about fortitude as a special virtue. So this is just to help us see where we could understand strength in a larger sense. And in a larger sense, each virtue is strong. There's not like temperance is not strong because it's not fortitude, therefore it's not strong. No, temperance is strong even though it's not called fortitude in the sense of a general virtue. But general virtue, it's probably just speaking in general would be better than calling it a general virtue in that sense. Because when we're really talking about fortitude, we're talking about facing danger and not just strength in general.
Does that notion of danger include or encompass danger in the face? Does that include that there's a challenging good? The notion of fortitude is when there's something good that's hard to do. Does that include that?
It does, but what we'll see is that, and that's where St. Thomas likes to get to, is and remember martyrdom, he's got martyrdom in the back of his mind. What characterizes most specifically an act of fortitude? Martyrdom. Okay, that's where St. Thomas is trying to get to. And so we can see danger, but some dangers are not life-threatening. Some dangers are, just, if we look too much at losing a higher good because of a lesser good, that's looking more like temperance. So that's where, when we're talking about fortitude, there really has to be something that's resisting, and not just something else that's easier or more attractive in the sense that more pleasant. There's a more pleasant solution, there's a more agreeable way, but it kind of takes me off the right path. That's temperance. That's the temperance problem. Whereas fortitude is like, I'm trucking, there's this obstacle. I don't want to press on. I want to back up or change my course. Now, sometimes there's prudence in that decision. So it's not like fortitude is the virtue of those who just careen into walls constantly because it's the strong thing to do. But no, we're talking about within a good reason, right? And once reason has been purified, then there's two ways that you can still not adhere to what's just and what's right, the right discernment. Either you lapse on pleasure or you lapse on discouragement. Like you hand over the goalie position to someone else so you don't have to defend the goal. So easier. So danger, facing a danger when it's necessary to protect the good or to reach the good. That's what fortitude especially refers to. It's pretty clear. Okay. I mean, if it's not, that's all right. I'll just try to hit it from a different angle. Any questions? Any thoughts? Any objections? Perhaps. Anybody want to tell St. Thomas how they feel about that? Yeah.
Therefore, Tully says that fortitude is deliberate facing of dangers and bearing of toils. In this sense, fortitude is reckoned a special virtue because it has a special matter.
And okay, so I'll put in here too, because that's another theme that we'll see coming out a lot is endurance. So facing danger or enduring something that's difficult. And that's where we hear how patience is connected to fortitude. Patience is that virtue that's connected there. Enduring.
Patience more so than humility?
Good question. We'll think about that. Everybody can scribble that one down. We'll meditate on it. Not that like it's exclusive or anything, but you know, that's a good question, but I think I would need to think about it a little bit more before I just started yakking. Okay. I yak pretty freely, so you can tell it's a good question if I stop myself. Right. Okay, let's reread that first objection. I think we're through it, right? Yes. Okay, good.
It seems that fortitude is not a special virtue, for it is written, she teaches temperance and prudence and justice and fortitude, where the text has virtue for fortitude. Since then the term virtue is common to all virtues. It seems that fortitude is a general virtue.
All right, let's read his reply. Go ahead.
According to the philosopher, the word virtue refers to the extreme limit of a power. Now, a natural power is, in one sense, the power of resisting corruptions, and in another sense is a principle of action. And since this latter meaning is the more common, the term virtue, as denoting the extreme limit of such a power, is a common term. For virtue taken in a general sense is nothing else than a habit whereby one acts well. But as denoting the extreme limit of power in the first sense, which since is more specific, it is applied to a special virtue, namely fortitude, to which it belongs to stand firm against all kinds of assaults.
Okay, so that's what we said. I think the thing that he introduces, which is an interesting addition, if you will, is that is talking about to the extreme limit of a power. So, like the highest, the high point of a power. So, in like he gave the example in nature, something that avoids corruption, like what allows a body to not decompose. Radically, it's the soul, right? As long as there's that high point of power that's holding that whole physical reality together, as one thing, there's no corruption. Well, in a similar way, just as the soul is the virtue of the body in terms of that strength that keeps the living being together and not just decomposing. So people's feet decompose. That's maybe a little lack of power on the side of the soul. I think it happens. You have another influence that comes in trying to eat the feet. These things happen, apparently. Like at Everest, your feet freeze. There's gangrene. It starts to decompose. These things happen. Leprosy, right. So diseases, so something else can come and attack the virtue of the soul. The soul's, power being to hold that together. Well, the virtues are these other kinds of high points of strength, extreme limits, right? That prevent, in an analogous way, decomposition. Right? Your act, you had set your sight on the right thing, and then something falls apart in the middle. Okay. Well, there's this strength that comes from virtue that keeps the act together, keeps it from falling apart. Extreme limit of strength, power that prevents corruption. So that's just a different angle of the same thing that we were looking at with power and with fortitude in the general sense of an absolute in terms of power. There's a kind of absolute that the soul has over the body in terms of keeping it as one and not decomposing. There's a kind of absolute in the virtue of prudence that keeps your life from going all over the place. There's a decomposing or corruption or that kind of corruption. So that's just an interesting perspective on how power holds an act together, how power holds a body together. Power can maintain the integrity of different things depending on what it's the principle of. And in the sense of these moral virtues, it's really the acts that it's able to maintain. Stand firm against all kinds of assaults. Good. Any additional thoughts on that? Questions or comments? And criticize St. Thomas if you want. That's also allowed.
What?
Criticize St. Thomas if there's anything in there that you think is foolish or poorly stated. That might be the translator's fault.
But in this one, he's just saying the sense of power as resisting corruption, the extreme of that is fortitude specifically, not just virtue in general?
I think that when he speaks about the virtues, in each virtue, taken individually, their fortitude is to perfectly exercise what they speak of. So if it's prudence, the virtue of prudence, the strength of prudence, is the extreme point where prudence is then never simply allowing things to take place, but always taking that action. So there's that extreme. Now, in all of the virtues, if you look not only at what each one individually is able to resist, but resistance itself is a virtue. So there's a kind of virtue of resisting corruption that is specially described by fortitude. And that's in the face of danger. Even when my life is threatened, etc., there's this firm hold. So firm hold in temperance is good. Firm hold in prudence is good. Firm hold in justice is good. But we really see that firm hold in its highest expression when there's when we're faced with danger. When you're actually directly resisting a kind of corruption that could take place against you. So. All right, third objection. Oh, we didn't do 2 yet. I'm sorry. I thought that went quickly. I was like, wait a minute. All right, objection 2. Where are we, Catherine?
Objection 2, sorry?
Mm-hmm.
Further, Ambrose says, fortitude is not lacking in courage, for alone she defends the honor of the virtues and guards their behests. She it is that wages an inexorable war on all vice, undeterred by toil, brave in face of dangers, steeled against pleasures, unyielding to lusts, avoiding covetousness as a deformity that weakens virtue. And he says the same further on in connection with other vices. Now this cannot apply to any special virtue, therefore fortitude is not a special virtue.
Okay, what would you say in reply to that objection? Or where do you think that this objection gets its strength? Is there a particular phrase in there, or a perspective that this objection suggests?
To me, it sounds similar to the first one,
Okay.
in that it's talking about fortitude as being something that all virtues have, or that is connected with,
Mm-hmm.
I don't really have a formed thought on it.
But I think you're right, because we see him bringing in notably things that would touch on temperance, right? Steeled against pleasures and yielding to lusts, avoiding covetousness. So there's he is certainly giving fortitude that quality of strength that we see also in temperance. But it's funny because Ambrose kind of turns this on its head when he says fortitude is not lacking in courage. For alone she defends, as though this is something specific about fortitude. And then fortitude is in the mix. So my thoughts, at least, I don't know, do any of you have any other thoughts on that objection?
I thought he just meant, like, because it seems so general that it's like waging war on all vices, that it can't be special.
Okay.
And that's what I got from it.
So the phrase where it says, she it is that wages an inexorable war on all vice. That part?
Yeah.
Since fortitude goes against every vice, therefore it's not special. It's part of all virtue. Right, so, but at the same time, we can see that he is trying to particularize fortitude by saying that fortitude has this special role.
Yeah, I was going to
fortitude is that it wages a war on all vice.
Mm-hmm. Right. Not just a redirection, but fortitude is on the offense, attacking, so to speak, challenging. Whereas the other virtues, it's not the way that the other virtues avoid vice is not necessarily by confrontation. Whereas fortitude doesn't avoid vice, it resists it directly. It confronts it directly. Whereas the other virtues, temperance, etc., isn't the same approach to, it says it tempers the greatest pleasure. So, remembers not to consider that only one thing as possible of goodness. Only pleasure is possible of goodness. No, we have to keep our perspective open. So temperance. I don't know. That's my thought. I think that there's a slightly different angle that fortitude has on its aggression against vice, because there's something aggressive about fortitude, whereas temperance, the aggression of temperance is fortitude. I don't know. That's what I get from this objection. That on the one hand, Ambrose is trying to say something specific about fortitude, and he ends up just saying something very general about it. So let's see what the reply is. I think Regina will. Oh, you read the. Okay, go ahead.
According to the philosopher, the word virtue...
Oops.
Oh, I'm sorry. Ambrose takes fortitude in a broad sense as denoting firmness of mind in face of assaults of all kinds. Nevertheless, even as a special virtue with a determinate matter, it helps to resist the assaults of all vices. For he that can stand firm in things that are most difficult to bear is prepared in consequence to resist those which are less difficult.
Interesting. So what do you make of that reply?
That fortitude is something that helps us anytime that we're trying to resist vice. And so it does, it helps generally in that sense, but it is a specific virtue that helps generally. That's all I can think of.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think the one interesting thing that comes out in this reply, to me, that I think was a little bit present, in what we were just talking about, is that there is a kind of fortitude even in temperance. Just like it says, he that can stand firm in things that are most difficult to bear is prepared in consequence to resist those which are less difficult. So it's amusing to see somebody who will stand up, and do some, extremely challenging thing, like go hike on a mountain. But then, when it comes to, wearing shoes that are a little bit uncomfortable, it's like, I can't live like this anymore. It's like, well, you just went to the moon, and now you need to have M&Ms on your sundae or something like that, otherwise you're sad. So something that clearly has to do with temperance, and then you'll wait a minute, there's an incongruity, there's something that doesn't make sense. How could you be so strong in this life-threatening situation, and then in something that's not life-threatening, just kind of whatever. Interesting phenomenon. Just goes to show that fortitude is first about firmness of mind and not about physical strength. Because Sometimes you can just take advantage of your physical strength, throw yourself out there, rah, if you're a man, of course, or a woman also. And then when it comes to not eating the chocolate on Friday just because it's Friday, that's a brother's thing. That's funny for religious because we do the no chocolate thing on Friday. Kind of. It's flexible enough that, if you did it, it's not like anybody would say anything. But at the same time, it's like, can you resist chocolate for one day a week, every week, for the rest of your life? But I can climb a mountain. So there is kind of this redundancy of fortitude even on temperance. And if it doesn't work both ways, then one could ask the question, are you truly strong of mind if you can't resist the chocolate, no matter what else you can do? Resisting temptation. Fortitude's role in that. Okay. And then we probably already read the reply to objection 3, but let's go ahead and read it because it's a little short objection there. Reply. Savannah?
We didn't read the objection.
Huh?
We didn't read the objection.
I know. So let's read the objection since we kind of read the reply is what I meant. Sorry.
Oh.
It was one line.
Further, fortitude would seem to derive its name from firmness, but it belongs to every virtue to stand firm, as stated in the Ethics? Is that these references? Therefore, fortitude is a general virtue.
Okay. So that's an objection coming from Latin, right? And so the Latin words nomen fortitudinis affirmitate sum esse videtur. So fortitudinis has firmitate in its name. So I guess it's a way to understand the roots of these words in Latin. But firmiter se avere pertinet ad omnem virtutem. And firmness is a quality of all virtues. Therefore, blah. And we know that that's still taking fortitude in the general sense. We have not addressed it in the specific sense. Any thoughts on that? Questions, objections?
Is it my imagination, or is that really similar to the other two?
It's very similar. Yeah, that's why St. Thomas didn't really dignify it with a full answer. But the interest of that one is, once again, just St. Thomas has a fascination also just with words and the word origin. So sometimes you'll see these objections that are just kind of drawing out the etymology of words and things like that. So that's why this one's thrown in there. Not because it has a new and special insight or a rational argument, but because it just allows us to see, how words developed, and yet we can still come up with a specific sense, even if they're general in their pieces and parts. Good. All right, let's start this third article. We proceed thus to the third article, whether fortitude is about fear and daring. Okay. It seems that fortitude is not about fear and daring. Okay, it is. All right, who's up next?
Objection 1. It seems that fortitude is not about fear and daring. For Gregory says, the fortitude of the just man is to overcome the flesh, to withstand self-indulgence, to quench the lusts of the present life. Therefore, fortitude seems to be about pleasures rather than about fear and daring.
Interesting objection. Now, I hope that you're perceiving as we go through this that there's this kind of going back and forth play between temperance and fortitude. And the whole purpose of that is to realize that they're not, they don't function independently of one another. Fortitude and temperance are not like these two independent functions of our ethical life. Those virtues work together, which would only make sense. I mean, why would you want a virtue like, sorry, it's not my job? Seems like a pretty useless virtue. No, that's about temperance. I'm not getting involved. Oh, that's about pleasure. Ooh. My job is when things get hard, not about the pleasure. So there's these clear distinctions that we can come up with, but there's overlap as well. So it helps to kind of force them back together a little bit, and then pull them apart, and then force them back together and pull them apart, because the mental exercise will help us see each one a little bit more clearly, which I think it probably has a little bit just in the last article and then this article. So remember, we've got temperance. You don't have to write this down. Don't write this down. Temperance and then fortitude. So is it about fear and daring? Well, Gregory of Jackson says a bunch of things that fortitude does that seem to have to do exclusively with temperance. What are those examples?
Overcoming the flesh.
Okay.
Withstanding self-indulgence. Quenching the lusts of the present life.
I mean, that sounds a lot like what temperance does, doesn't it? I would...
But it can be scary to try to overcome
Exactly.
the flesh, and it's daring to withstand self-indulgence.
So I think that, what's interesting is that even though the object, so to speak, self-indulgence, lusts, seems specific about temperance, something that temperance should be dealing with. It's the the inner attitude in face of these particular temptations. Overcome, withstand, quench. This is a much more kind of aggressive language, if you will. So those are kinds of interesting things to note. Even though the object itself really has to do with what temperance is supposed to be focusing on. Pleasure, self-indulgence, kind of flesh is in the sense of pleasure. Lusts, that's pleasure. The object each time is pleasure. But the way in which it's confronted is with strength. So there's this, we can see a little bit. Let's look then now at any thoughts on that? Okay, keep going. On the contrary.
The philosopher says that fortitude is about fear and daring.
Thank you. Well, we didn't even bother with the church fathers or anything. Just cut straight to the philosopher. Okay.
I answer that. As stated above, it belongs to the virtue of fortitude to remove any obstacle that withdraws the will from following the reason. Now, to be withdrawn from something difficult belongs to the notion of fear, which denotes withdrawal from an evil that entails difficulty, as stated above.
In the treatise on the passions. So is that part pretty good, pretty straightforward? Questions on those couple lines? What that means exactly? So nothing, yep. Nobody asked, so keep going.
Hence, fortitude is chiefly about fear of difficult things, which can withdraw the will from following the reason. And it behoves one not only firmly to bear the assault of these difficulties by restraining fear, but also moderately to withstand them, when, to wit, it is necessary to dispel them altogether in order to free oneself therefrom for the future, which seems to come under the notion of daring. Therefore, fortitude is about fear and daring, as curbing fear and moderating daring.
Okay, interesting. So why, what are fear and daring? Like if we're analyzing how fear and daring are situated in us as living beings.
The emotions.
So emotions, the passions, when St. Thomas talks about the passions, there's this list, a limited list. Say 7, I guess, 7 passions. 7's a nice number. Maybe there's 8. I have to go back and count. But daring is obviously one passion, and fear is another passion. Fear is the passion that... Regina, any ideas? What is fear as a passion? What does it do? It's facing what kind of thing, and what is its reaction? Because those passions, once again, are things that we feel. So fear, I feel fear when I am faced with what? Which is... because it could be something else, right? Spiders. What do spiders and I don't know. What are you afraid of, Savannah?
I think just too much uncertainty.
Uncertainty, that's a huge one. A fear of uncertainty. We hear about that. What about you? It doesn't have to be profound. It can just be simple. Fear of failure. Catherine? We don't have to go where this is not. Don't worry, it's not supposed to be personal. It's just, you can keep it light if you want.
Slipping on ice and cracking my head.
Slipping on ice. Okay. So what do all of those things have in common? No, those things. Because when you say retraction, you're talking about your reaction.
Aren't they dangerous to our well-being?
Maybe spiders might be, falling on ice might be
dangerous.
Right, perceived. And that's super important. Because when we look at the passions, it's a perceived good or evil. So a sensible good or evil. So that object provokes a reaction in me, a passion of fear, if it is a sensible evil. This feels bad. This seems to be bad. My perception of this is bad. Now, if we stop and stand, is it really evil? Is uncertainty really evil? Is failure really evil? Is a spider really evil?
Yes.
So there is a little bit of consensus on that, but it's because perhaps there is necessarily all spiders are poisonous and are intent on biting you. If that's true about spiders, then yes, spiders are evil. But so we can see that fortitude is about that passion, fear, and about daring. Now, what object causes the emotion or the passion of daring in you? We'll do this again. Savannah. When do you feel daring?
I don't know, that's an even harder question.
Okay, but give us something
I
that
think
causes
I
you...
feel daring when I am in an environment where I know that I am loved.
I was just
Okay.
going to say something really simple. That's really interesting.
That's good. Let's try to concretize a little bit. It could be like an experience where you remember feeling daring. It doesn't have to be one that where you would necessarily feel daring, but one that in the past you're like, oh, I remember I really took on that challenge. Just, and I felt like, yeah, I can do this. It's that feeling of daring. What's your experience of that feeling?
What just came to mind is like being in New York City with all that traffic, but still being like, I'm going to get to that side of the street. Like,
Great. Good. Okay.
Or just do it.
Like an action, like climbing on rocks on the side of a cliff or jumping out of a plane.
Okay. Because kind of we'll get to the because, but that's good. Let's keep that. Go ahead. When have you felt daring in the past? You've done something daring. You're like, I did it.
On the basketball court today.
I mean, we have these experiences regularly. So remember, it doesn't have to be a gigantic thing. These emotions are things that we should experience.
Trying a new move in basketball.
Okay. All right, daring. There you go. Trying a new move in basketball. Okay.
Savannah, you should have seen it.
And you, Savannah, did you give one?
Under the leg
Well, you
thing.
didn't
It was
like
crazy.
Oh no.
Try
So
again.
try it. It's good. Try something like concrete.
Yeah,
Also.
okay. Well, I felt daring when I did like the 4-day canoe race across Belize.
Okay.
That felt very daring.
So let's try to find what is common in these different experiences at a felt level in terms of the object. So now we're like, okay, these different objects, the New York City traffic, the climbing rocks, skydiving, the new move in basketball, and the, 4-day canoeing trip. Canoeing?
Yeah.
Okay, in Belize. What was that thing? What can we say about it? It wasn't something evil, but
Always something good. Yeah, sorry.
I was going to say it was something we weren't sure we could pull off or succeed in. Is that what you're looking for?
I've just any answer at this point is still valid.
The object of like getting across the street seems good, but in Catherine's example, the traffic almost seems like an evil.
But it was
Absolutely.
But we're
it
just talking
was
about
like
the
for me in that experience, it was like I want to get to that museum. The only way over is through this traffic, and so it's like it's worth it. And I had a general sense of confidence that I could do it, even though it was going to be a pretty hairy experience. But it was going to be worth getting there,
So
in my judgment.
go ahead. Yeah, good. That's good. That's very good.
I think it's because it's something that's not typical. You could die. You could.
Okay, so there's a danger, there's an obstacle, there's a challenge. I think that's true about all of the things that you guys mentioned, right? But I feel like it's worth a shot.
Yeah.
Right? And that's really the passion of daring. That's what it says. There's a good that seems possible, but there's an obstacle. It's worth it. It feels like it's worth it to push through the obstacle, whatever the obstacle might be. Even though, maybe, I'll have a car accident. It could happen. Maybe the parachute won't open. That would be enough for me to not skydive. Maybe the move won't work out, right? Maybe the canoe will get a hole in it and your socks will be wet the whole time because you're wearing socks.
They're crocodile. They're like.
Oh, see, that's okay. I didn't know that.
Very daring.
So now, we'll stop with this thought because we're at the end of our time. What do you think is then the difference between daring and fortitude? Because what we talked about seems like, well, wait, that's good. You should try to overcome an obstacle for something that's good. Isn't that what fortitude is doing?
Wouldn't be the difference?
There's a piece of what would make it virtuous that's missing. And what is that piece in our like concrete experience?
Well, if the good is truly a good.
Right. So there's the
In line
rectitude
with
of
our
reason in discerning whether or not it's a good. So we take the example of skydiving, not to pick on Regina or anything. What is the real good of skydiving? Question mark. Put it on the shelf. Come back to some other. We've had this discussion last year. So, so is there a real good in skydiving? Now, in basketball, we could ask the same thing about basketball. In basketball, what is the real good of, accomplishing this move?
The look on Catherine's face.
That's,
When she
there's
confuses
something.
me on the court.
if we're really careful to think about it, it's like, wait a minute, there's not something ultimately important about skydiving. Every human being doesn't have to skydive in order to be a human being. They can still accomplish it in lots of other ways. Basketball is just a game, so any win in one of those situations that I might get won't actually have, especially if I'm not a professional, any sort of real benefit for my life as a human being. Just, it's nice. Feels good to win. Right? So there we really have those sensible goods, right? So the difference is between fortitude and daring, at least in that perspective, is we're looking at a spiritual good versus a sensible good. And sometimes, even if you don't feel like being like you're daring, in order to have, to actually do what's right, you still have to stand up. Even if you're not feeling courageous, even if you're not feeling brave, even if you're not feeling daring, because of a real good, I have to stand here anyway, even though I'm not feeling very daring. So, without the feeling, absolutely possibility for virtue. I think that's...
But not for daring, because that is the definition of daring, is that...
So daring is the
passion.
sensation. Now, you can also have fortitude and a sensation of daring. But I would say that usually what happens when people are very daring is that they don't necessarily think through the whole thing. There's a piece of thought that gets missed. Well, anyway, so those are things to think about. It's very interesting. So we'll stop there and finish with Article 3 in a couple of weeks.
Is class canceled on Monday then?
No, it is Francesco who's going to do his catechism class. And then when I get back on Thursday, I'm going to do, Thursday morning.